Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Spotlight Talk today. So glad to have you all with us. I'll just wait a moment as everyone's starting to filter in. We got a great crowd today. We're very excited to talk about the drop leaf desk with everyone. My name is Katie Wynn. I am the Deputy Director of Operations and Public Engagement at the Wharton Esherick Museum, and I'm joined with by my colleague Ethan Snyder, who will be leading the talk today. Ethan is the Manager of Collections and Public Programs at the museum. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get going. If you haven't been on one of these talks before, what we like to do is ask that everyone remains mute for the presentation itself. And then at the end, you can either unmute yourself to give a comment, ask a question, or throughout the talk, if you'd like to put comments and questions in the chat, we'll take a look at those towards the end of the talk. And with that, I will turn it over to Ethan.
Cool. Thanks, Katie. So welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Ethan Snyder, and I'm the Manager of Collections and Public Programs here at the Wharton Esherick Museum. I want to thank everyone for joining this month's Spotlight Talk and continuing to engage with us virtually while our site continues to be closed to the public until the beginning of March. So our tour calendar will be opening up in early February, so keep your eyes peeled for announcements on our website, e-news, and via social media. So this month's Spotlight Talk focuses on a project that we're really not easily able to undertake during our tour season with visitors coming through the studio every day. And that's disassembling Esherick's 1927 drop leaf desk made of red oak. We're preparing to send a bunch of objects out on loan to the Brandywine River Museum in October for the exhibit The Crafted World of Wharton Esherick. So keep your eyes peeled for more announcements about that exhibition as it gets closer. So taking apart a piece of furniture ahead of it being transported helps us know what to expect come moving day. And that way we won't encounter any last-minute surprises. So the exhibit with the Brandywine will bring together a select group of objects, including furniture, sculpture, painting, prints, and photographs, exclusively sourced from Esherick's home and studio, and bring them to a broader public. So taking apart a piece of furniture, in my mind, really never fails to breathe new life into it, no matter how old or how new it is. And it allows us to learn things about how it was made, how it was put together, and why it looks the way it does. We're really excited to share with you all what we learned about Esherick's dropleaf desk during its assembly a little earlier this month. Before we jump into the nuts and bolts, though, I want to provide a little bit of context for this desk and tell you a bit about why it's one of my personal favorites from our collection. So if you've had the opportunity to take a tour of Esherick's studio, as I'm sure many of you have, you've seen this piece opened up right before your eyes. As a whole, the desk contains three main sections that I outlined here. The top section has two cupboards and the main drop leaf that hides a beautiful leather writing surface and many cubbies for storage. The second piece below is a large cabinet that opens up to a plethora of flat file storage for papers and things like that. And then the base of the desk contains one huge drawer that pulls out to store oversized papers and other materials. What I personally love about this desk is its relationship between its form and its intended function. Esherick designed and used it to store printmaking materials like woodblocks, papers, and prints among its various cubbies and drawers. The carved panels appearing throughout the desk's surface, I think, speak wonderfully to its intended purpose as storage for carved woodblocks and the prints they're used to create. I always tell our visitors that they can think of these large carved panels like large woodblocks themselves, and that if one chose to ink the panels of Esherick's dropleaf desk, we could subsequently print from them. So after the 1930s, Esherick largely moved away from the kind of surface carvings that we see with the dropleaf desk. However, surface carving was a large part of Esherick's practice in the years immediately surrounding the desk's creation. Esherick made a similar dropleaf desk for his wife Letty between 1926 and 1927, featuring a carved eagle and two kneeling figures, as you can see on the right. And Esherick carried the carved bird motif elsewhere that same year with his trifold wooden screen that's in the collection of the MFA Boston, as well as for the loading doors for his studio. So Bob Bascom writes in his biography of Esherick that the artist's cabinet-making friend and collaborator John Schmidt wasn't really of much help in creating this dropleaf desk because of its sculptural qualities. However, Esherick recollects something a little bit different in his oral history taken sometime before his death. So in his oral history, Esherick recalls that Schmidt indeed helped him to make this desk in his hillside studio. And I quote Esherick here: "I did some of the dovetails on it, but I'm not a cabinet maker. I did the dovetails on all those little drawers inside and the dovetails on the end of that desk." End quote. The beautiful wooden hinges that are integral to the door's structures were John Schmidt's work. And here you can see the dovetails on the ends of the cabinet that hide the end grain on the sideboards, as well as these little dovetails here on the small drawers inside of the main case. So before we disassembled this piece, of course, we had to empty it of all, sorry about that, this kitten's getting crazy. We had to empty it of all of the different materials that were inside, such as pieces of ephemera like maps, invitations, awards, art supplies, little fragments of various things. And here you can see some of that stuff emptied out. One of the most wonderful objects I think that we found inside is an old disused swinging lamp that Esherick carved to actually fit inside the desk to provide more light while he worked at it. And the lamp fits into a small hole that you can find beneath the cubby, and the wire is fed through this hole in the back of the cabinet. And if you visited Esherick's studio before, you know that swinging lights abound on the ceilings, and I'm led to believe that this little swinging lamp might have been Esherick's first. So our disassembly primarily required removing the main dropleaf section with the cupboards above from the bottom half of the piece. And you can see here that there are 3 large screws that run through the bottom of the cubbies behind the dropleaf into the top section below that holds flat file storage. So unscrewing these bolts allowed us to remove the top relatively easily off of the lower section. And in these photos here, you can see Casey Chu, our our visitor engagement and facilities manager, Andy Gustine, our building preservation director, and myself lifting the top off the desk. I'll admit that these two did most of the heavy lifting, but nonetheless, taking the top off of this desk was absolutely thrilling. And we estimate that the top case weighs somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds. In this photograph, you can see the unfinished oak beneath the top of the dropleaf desk, and I think that the stark difference in color is really, really nice to see. And I'll point out here that we found a beautiful smattering of blue paint on the back wall that is so bright as it's been preserved, hiding behind the back of the desk for quite some time. After removing the top, we could also glean some of the work that Esherick put into rounding Schmidt's square dovetail corners with a rasp, giving this desk some of its really beautiful sculptural qualities. It's most likely that the desk was constructed with these corners flat and given the soft edges with a rasp after it was put together. Next, we were able to examine the back of the top case that's made with wooden boards that are stained this dark red on both sides. The fact that these boards are stained on both sides suggests to me that they were stained well before they were installed in the desk. The boards are joined to one another with a mix of tongue and groove joints as well as lap joints and nailed to the back of the case to stay on. And in this photo, you'll notice the areas around the nails are gouged out. So without a countersink drill bit, these areas had to be gouged out so that the nails would be flush with the wooden boards. And I'll admit, I'm not quite clear on what year drill bits came into use, but some initial research on patents tells me that this desk might predate the use of that type of hardware. So the sliding dovetails and dado joints that you see here on the back of the case piece correspond to some of the horizontal dividers, such as the one that divides the top cupboards from the main dropleaf section, and some of these horizontal cubbies that are built into the desk and are not meant to be pulled out like some of the others are. Additionally, Esherick's dropleaf desk retains a really, really wonderful label on the back side from the last time that it was removed from the studio. In 1961, the desk was shown at the Brooklyn Museum for the exhibit Masters of Contemporary Craft. The photo on the left shows the desk at the Brooklyn Museum for this exhibit among some of Esherick's other work. And in the photo on the right, you'll notice the quirky misspelling of Esherick's name, as well as the loan number 21.6.121A that was tied to this particular piece. Next, we removed the very bottom drawer in order to determine whether the base of the desk could be removed from the adjoining flat file storage and taken apart into 3 pieces rather than just 2. We discovered a number of things underneath or inside of this base, mainly dust. However, taking this drawer out revealed that the bottom of the drop leaf is actually open and that there's no dustboard beneath the drawer to close the bottom off. We also determined that there's really no good way to remove the base unless we were to flip the entire bottom section of the desk upside down. Now, this is because the desk has, or the base of the desk has 4 nails, 2 on each side that join the base to the section above, with the nails coming in from below rather than from above. In other words, the desk must have been turned upside down to nail the base on. And in this photograph, you can see that the areas were dug out so that the nails could go straight into the case above rather than at an angle. And this little thing here is just a little spider egg. That's not one of the nails there. Now I want to highlight some of the surface treatment that we found on this desk because I think it's quite interesting. So removing the top part of the case allowed us to examine the back in a way that is clearer than we've ever been able to examine it before. You can see between the center photo and the one on the right that both sides of those backboards are stained this dark red, as I had mentioned earlier. The staining on the back of the desk has over time undoubtedly dulled due to exposure to light, to dust, and other kinds of elements. But the staining on the other side of the boards that appear on the inside of the cabinet have retained this really wonderful richness and depth of color, as you can see here on the right. Being on the inside of the desk itself, the staining has been largely protected from the light and dust that has dulled the color on the back. So not unlike how a centuries-old book that is rarely opened tends to preserve drawings and illuminations on the inside, the desk has well preserved this red stain. The photograph on the left gives us an idea of when the desk's surface was finished during the process of putting the whole piece together. Once we removed the top section of the desk, we saw that the area beneath was actually left unfinished. And in this photograph here, you can see those drip stains on the inside of the flat file storage area. And these drip stains suggest that the exterior of the desk was finished after the desk was constructed. So coating the exterior of the already finished or constructed dropleaf desk with linseed oil, Wharton's favorite, would lead the excess oil to drip down through the seams and cracks into the interior as we see in that photo on the left. These drips were likely left from coating the rounded dovetailed corners and that horizontal surface that the dropleaf sits on top of. Finally, I want to show off the oak's whiteness as we found it underneath some of the hardware. Earlier in the winter, our conservator Mark Anderson and I removed a piece of the hardware from the frame of the main dropleaf section in order to determine a way that we can kind of configure a lock for this desk while it's out on loan. This involved us removing the hardware for the magnetic latch that works in conjunction with a ball clasp to keep the dropleaf closed. And it was truly amazing to see how white the unfinished oak was almost 100 years later, especially as it contrasts to the dark finish just next to it. So before we begin to wrap up, I want to offer some conjectures on kind of what order all the pieces of this desk were put together in to make the final product. And then I want to offer some brief remarks that discuss how this desk has changed over time. So putting together and examining the documentation we took while disassembling this piece was really thought-provoking and enlightening. It helps us understand not only the work that went into creating this quite gigantic desk, but also the order its various pieces were put together in. So it appears that first Schmidt must have dovetailed those large exterior case pieces at the top and in the middle, with the drawer runners probably already installed before these pieces were put together. Um, Next, the case that holds the flat file storage must have been flipped over and the base nailed to the bottom and then turned back over. Then Esherick and Schmidt likely installed the stretchers and the non-movable drawers in that main section here from the back, like we saw earlier behind the panels. And they used those dado joints and sliding dovetails. And they probably at that point also put the large drawer into the base. The backboards were then stained on both sides and nailed to the back of the desk. The top and bottom cases were then joined together with those large screws that we had to take out in order to remove the top section. And by that point, the body of the desk is largely already assembled. And Esherick was left to attach and pin the carved doors, soften his corners, and finish the oak with linseed oil before finally installing the movable flat file storage towards the bottom here. While making this desk was undoubtedly a huge undertaking, the time it took to actually create it is really only a tiny, tiny blip in its close to 100-year life. We can discern a few main changes that this desk has undergone since it was built in the 1920s. And these changes are mainly due to the fact that this desk is constructed of large wooden boards that tend to expand and contract over time, like most wood does. Many of the carved panels, for example, have shrunk and cracked over the years. This is likely because Esherick was carving up these fairly large slabs that had swelled and shrunk with changing temperatures. So we can see in this photograph here how the panels have cracked on the cupboard door, and the photo on the bottom right and in the center show us that main panel and the way it shrunk. So here we see the corner of this main panel, and it's actually, we can kind of discern some empty space where the panel has shrunk and come away from the frame. And in the center photo, if you can follow this darkened line here, that was, we can call that a shadow mark of where that used to be covered by the frame. But now that the panel has shrunk over the years, we can see where it used to be covered with this darkened line. And then finally, while we were examining the dropleaf desk while it was taken apart, we noticed that the backboards were kind of coming out a little bit from the back of the case. And this is not a great photo, but you can see in between these two nails, there's a piece of wood there. And that's one of the drawer runners for the flat file storage. And we asked ourselves, why was it made too long for the actual case of this desk? And after thinking about it for a little bit, we determined that actually the sides of the desk, because they're big oak boards, have shrunk over time, and the stretchers have not shrunk. So as the sides have shrunk, the stretchers have pushed against the back of the desk, opening up that space that we see there. And finally, I kind of want to end with an outstanding question that we weren't able to solve during our examination of the dropleaf desk. So we've noticed that this number 986 is tooled into the leather writing surface towards the left-hand side of the desk. And we're really curious why this number appears on the leather on Esherick's desk, who tooled it in, and what purpose did it serve. And I think that there are a few possibilities, although by this juncture, none of them are close to conclusive, but it will require some more research as well. So I wonder if it's possible that the leather that Esherick used for the desk was actually repurposed from another object, where this number 986 might have meant something in particular. We know that reuse was definitely part of Esherick's furniture making practice. Another possibility is that this number could have been from a supplier that Esherick obtained the leather from. And it could have been a number that identified the type of leather, the way it was tanned, its color, or something about the property of the material. Finally, is it possible that this number might have been tooled into the leather by Esherick himself while working at this desk? We know that Esherick oftentimes scribbled, sketched, took notes, and did some math on scrap paper, letters, and things like that. And I wonder whether it's possible that Esherick might have scratched this number in for some reason to remind himself of something. So as I said, I don't think that we can confidently say that one of these possibilities is more likely than another. It could be a possibility that we haven't really thought up yet. But it's these kinds of unanswered questions that I find really valuable because they lead us to think a little bit more deeply about the material, whether it's how it's used, how it's acquired, the different things that these materials mean to different people, whether it's Esherick working atop the desk, at his writing surface, maybe a figurative leather supplier, a tanner, or past user. So that about wraps up the spotlight for today. Keep your eyes peeled for more news about our tour calendar and upcoming events. And I think it's about time that we open it up for questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen. But if we want to go back to see other photos, I'll be happy to pull that up again. So I see some questions here in the chat, one from Bonnie. What will the inside Oh, well, what was inside the desk be put back for the exhibit at the Brandywine? That's a question that we'll have to discuss. Um, I think it depends on how the museum wants to interpret the piece. But I think that, sending it out for exhibition definitely brings up questions like that. And it also raises questions of, if we want to preserve the old exhibition label from the 60s on the back of the cabinet, do we just want to take it off and store it all together to keep it safe so it doesn't fall off during transportation and get lost? And I see another question from Bonnie. Why was it taken apart to move? It could not be moved in two pieces. Um, so the reason that we wanted to take this apart before moving it is because it is, I think, in total, over 200 pounds. And the more pieces that we can take it apart in, the easier each piece is to transport. So it's really, focusing on the safety of the object as well as the movers and how they can most easily transport it to different locations.
Thank you. Well done. And I have an anecdote, if I may share.
Yeah, go for it, Rob.
Back around 2010, Rick Dark was a curator at the Longwood Gardens, and he had written a book about the American woodland garden. And he was very familiar with the studio, visited quite often, and included that in the book. And in the fall of that year, he and his wife and a couple of their friends came out, and I walked them through the studio. And when we got to the drop leaf desk, after I displayed it, he said, Rob, you realize this is a three-dimensional piece. I said, I think I know what you mean, but I'm not sure. Explain what your thinking is. He said, when you look at the bottom section, you're looking at the tree bark, and you have to be really close to the tree to see that fine bark. He said, but then to see the branches, you got to step further back into the forest and look up and see the branches. He said, in order to see the birds flying above the branches, you have to step even further back into the forest. So he said, it's a three-dimensional piece.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
That was so fun.
So I see,
Brilliant.
oh, go for it.
No, I was just saying that's brilliant, like so cool that you brought that up.
It was a fun moment for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Rob. That's definitely a
Yeah.
new way to
Yeah.
think about moving around that cabinet and engaging with it in new ways.
Esherick's pieces have 1,000 nuances,
Yeah. So I see that there's a question about plans for restoration in the future. As of now, we don't really have any large restoration plans. Our conservator and I have been undertaking some kind of spot treatments to the desk. We found some abrasions on the main panel of the drop leaf. So we're trying to figure out how to kind of stabilize the object a little bit more, make it look as presentable as possible. But from being able to examine the desk in the round, I don't think that there is any need for any large restoration on it, which is really nice because Esherick and John Schmidt seemed to know what they were doing and they did a great job. And I see a question about colored stain on other pieces, or was the red on the interior of this desk a unique thing? So Esherick did work in really subtle pops of color in his work. If you've been to the studio, or if you go on our website and look at Esherick's cabinet desk, it uses these kind of fanning patterns in it. And in between the fanning shapes, there are actually very small blue splines of wood. And as the wood contracts during the winter time, those splines become more visible. So we know that Esherick was using these subtle pops of color, but what I relate that stain to in the dropleaf desk most closely is the stain on the floor of the studio.
I have a question. You said you saw the blue on the wall, bright, brilliant blue. Are you going to preserve that or put a piece of glass so people can see what the color of it was?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think as of now, it's pretty well preserved by the cabinet desk or the dropleaf desk being precisely where it is and kind of hiding that from any light. Um, that'll be up for discussion whether we want to do something with that pop of blue paint while the dropleaf desk leaves the studio for some time. But just all in all, it was something that was a little surprising to see. Where we found that blue splatter is actually underneath where Esherick's his mixing palette is, which is hung on the wall. But it doesn't necessarily, in my perspective, seem to warrant the kind of treatment that maybe the collections objects do. But it's definitely something to think about what we can, different ways to interpret that and what we can do with it. And it tells us a little bit maybe about where Esherick was working, how he was working, as they are kind of signs of his own practice. I see that Tom asked if there's environmental humidity control to minimize movement. There is. We keep the studio somewhere between 68 and maybe 71, 72. And by and large, we've been able to keep the temperature quite steady in there for the safety of the objects in the building.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That's really I feel like we had a big boost in our signups for this spotlight talk because the idea of having behind the scenes information and then deep dive into the dropleaf desk was sort of like the perfect mixture. Like, who could say no? I feel like I learned a lot, especially I think I was someone who thought that the dropleaf desk was one of his did it all himself pieces, and to learn that John Schmidt had more of a role in it than I realized was actually was really interesting. So I'm glad that you were able to sort of highlight him in that way. There was a question earlier on that I don't know if we kind of missed when we were reading through, but someone had sort of asked about the credit given to Schmidt. And I feel like he is someone that I know all of us on tour now are always talking about him and including him in how we frame Esherick's legacy and how critical he was to how all these pieces came to be. So yeah, it was just really nice to have him kind of brought back into the conversation with the dropleaf desk too. Yeah. Are there other?
If I might add on to that, Katie.
Sure.
When I first saw the piece, when Bob Bascom walked me through the studio, the way he presented that desk was, he said, this is the first major piece that Esherick ever did on his own. Mm-hmm. He said he wanted to show Schmidt how he wanted his furniture to look. Now, obviously, Schmidt worked on it, but among the things was he didn't want to hide the dovetailing. He didn't want to veneer over it and so forth. So he wanted to give Schmidt an idea how he perceived furniture. How much each man worked on it, I don't know, but Bob presented as this was Esherick's first major piece, whatever that means.
Yeah. And in a way that makes some sense, that if you were trying to convey to someone who, you know, had gone through technical cabinet making, like how do I tell you I want to make this other different artistic.
I'm a sculptor, not a cabinet maker, you know.
Right. Here's a visual communication of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. Is the wood locally harvested, and did you notice anything about the tool marks that indicated whether it was hand hewn or, you know, purchased?
Yeah, so I think by 1927, Esherick had not quite kind of hooked up with his lumber supply guy, Ed Ray. We know or have some records that suggest that John Schmidt was supplying Wharton with his wood by that point. You know, he lived right around the corner. He had a furniture business that was largely repairing people's broken furniture, not really making new furniture. And he had access to local hardwoods, tropical hardwoods as well. Um, I think, you know, beyond the gouging and things like that, it was hard to discern tool marks. But I imagine as he was working with John Schmidt, they would have been using his bandsaw. Esherick was using his rasp for those corners. I'm sure he was using some of his carving tools to do the surface carvings as well. But I think it would require us to go a step further and maybe strip other parts off of it to really get an idea of how those big boards were cut and with what machinery.
If I may here, I can add something to that. That lumber definitely did not come from Ed Ray. He didn't come back to this area until 1932. And my guess is that John Schmidt probably supplied it because he had a bandsaw sawmill that when Ed did get back here, he used. And the shrinkage that you noticed, my guess is also that was not kiln dried lumber. More than likely, it was air dried, and air dried lumber will expand and contract a lot more than what the kiln dried would. But just to add that little bit about Ed, it was definitely pre Ed Ray.
Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
Yeah, your expertise is much appreciated, Ray. Yeah, and I do want to just very briefly speak to that point about John Schmidt and his contributions. I think that, you know, oftentimes someone who makes the piece and who has it under their name will be the one that receives the most credit. But even if we were to go to, you know, the Art Museum in Philadelphia and look at a Chippendale chair, we could, you know, with a lot of confidence say that was not made by Chippendale himself. And even if it was made in his shop or the shop of another big name cabinet maker, there are so many hands that go into every piece of furniture. So I think that, you know, there are outstanding questions about, you know, the exact nature of Esherick and Schmidt's collaboration. But I always tend to kind of highlight that Esherick was really lucky to be surrounded by the skilled craftspeople he was in Chester County, because he wouldn't have really been able to make the things he did without the knowledge that they had, that he would readily admit he did not.
Could I ask one other question? And of course, if others have them as well before we wrap up. I've had so many people ask on tour, how heavy is that desk? They always want to know, how heavy is that? Are we going to know after moving it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if we can get a scale.
It sounded like you had an estimate on half of it.
Yeah, we had an estimate on half of it. And since they're, you know, by and large the same dimensions, we could say it's probably, you know, between 200 and 350, including the base. But, you know, taking the weight of objects is not really something that museums tend to do, although I think that it would kind of tell us a lot about different pieces in museum collections to know how much they weigh, especially when you're seeing something on a screen, it's hard to understand the scale of a piece. And even if you're standing in front of something, you have no idea how heavy or light it could be. We have a
Right.
small patent grass sculpture that's made of mahogany. And because it's that dense tropical hardwood, it's way heavier than you would assume it is.
Mm.
Well, thanks for all your effort in getting it to the Brandywine.
Yes, yes. Does anybody have any last questions or comments before we wrap up? Definitely put that Brandywine exhibit on your radar for October. We'll be talking about it lots more as it gets closer. And as Ethan said, we've got a virtual spotlight next month as well. Even though we are close to the public, our virtual programs continue. And then we'll be back open for tours in March. In February, the spotlight is about books, and we're sort of looking towards Wharton's library for a little bit of inspiration. So stay tuned for the details on that as well. And yeah, any last questions or comments from anyone? If not, then thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you everybody for tuning in and joining us for your lunchtime.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.